second. All right, so we just had this Forever Young conference at CIIS and the San Francisco Jung Institute. Also was a co-sponsor. You didn't get to hang out with us in person at the Jung Institute there, but I did enjoy your presentation on the parallels between Jung and Simondon, which are not accidental, but there's a direct line of influence there. Simondon even choosing this term individuation, maybe because of his reading of Jung, or do you think it's other than that? But maybe you could just lay out relatively briefly, what do you feel like the important connections between Simondon and Jung are? And then I'm sure we'll find our way into a conversation about how to think the pre-individual, the Pleroma in their respective terms, Simondon and Jung's respective terms, and then probably end up bringing in some Whiteheadian ideas. I will, at least, and we can get down to business.
Shall I share my screen at some point and we work through some of the
The
content?
quotes and stuff, sure.
Okay, yeah, so we can do that. And that'll be a way for us to get into some of the nitty-gritty of the shared of the analogies, as you were saying, that we can make between Jung and Simondon's perspectives. But also, yeah, there is absolutely a direct influence. I mean, did Simondon choose the term individuation because of a debt to Jung? Is it a reference to Jung? I mean, certainly that claim has been made. Um, Simondon does not say that specifically, and of course, individuation is not a term that was invented by Jung. And it might be like, it's a little bit like how the word evolution is so associated with Darwin or whatever. But I think what's really, really key, and that's a quote that we can look at maybe in a minute to sort of kick us off on looking at some of the slides, is that at the end of a presentation that Simondon gives, so Simondon does mention Jung a number of times in his work, but not a great deal. But I think there's this very significant moment at the end of a presentation that he gives, which is titled and published as Form, Information, and Potentials, and is present in volume 2 of Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, which many would consider Simondon's masterwork, his magnum opus, and it is his primary thesis, PhD thesis, and it was published in 2005 in French. Finally, it was the complete form of the thesis was published, but along with all these supplementary materials in a volume 2, and that was finally translated into English. All of that in 2020 by my friend Taylor Adkins, and in Volume 2, there is a seminar presentation, Form, Information, and Potentials. And that is one of Simondon's primary attempts, I think, to provide a real overview of his project. This is 1960 now, so he finishes his PhD in 58, finishes the individuation thesis in 58, and also the technical objects book, which is his complementary thesis. In 1960, so 2 years later, he gives this talk, and he's giving it to, a panel of heavy-hitting French philosophers, including some of his supervisors like Jean Hippolyte, but Jean Wall is there, and a bunch of other people. So it's fairly major names from the previous generation of French philosophers. And they're basically in a panel, and there's actually a discussion. Or Paul Ricoeur actually is also there, and importantly because he and Simondon have a pretty funny back and forth. But Simondon presents this overview of his project to this panel, and it's just very significant to me that right at the end, when he's wrapping it up, he has this long quote which I can read. Where is it? Oh shit. Excuse me.
697. It's 697, right? Yeah.
697 of Elfie, yeah, but I've got it on this slide here, and I'll share these in just a moment, but I'll let you respond first. But He basically says he's been talking about individuation. He's been talking about the process of de-differentiation, which is an important notion for Simondon, but I think also for Jung. And Simondon says, in other words, we should consider the process of de-differentiation within a social body or within an individual entering into a crisis period, just as the alchemists of yesteryear considered liquefactio, dissolution, or nigrefactio, putrefaction, i.e., the first moment of the magnum opus when alchemists placed the prima materia into the retort. He goes on. Jung discovers in the alchemist's aspiration the expression of the operation of individuation and of all the forms of sacrifice, which suppose the return to a state comparable to that of birth, i.e., a return to a richly potentialized, not yet determined state, a domain for the new propagation of life. Key part now. If it is possible to generalize this schema and to elaborate it through the notion of information, through the study of the metastability of conditions, we can set out to found the axiomatics of a human science on a new theory of form. Okay, that's his project. Um, this is Simondon describing the scope of his project, and in particular the scope of the major thesis, but it's the scope of his project altogether, I think, and many of his other works, obviously including the Technical Objects book, but also later courses that he taught on perception, imagination and invention and other things at the Sorbonne are all, the real nucleus of the whole thing is this theory of individuation. And really there he's crediting Jung with this discovery in alchemy, and he's saying that I'm generalizing this schema of individuation. I'm elaborating it through the notion of information and metastability, and that, of course, is his encyclopedic study of the science of his time. He's heavily indebted to cybernetics, but very critical of it. He's critical of the standard formulation of information that is used in cybernetics and also in Shannon and Weaver, of course. He's studying thermodynamics, he's studying quantum mechanics, he's doing all of these things, a lot of biology, etc. And the end goal is this setting out to found an axiomatics of a human science on a new theory of form. So it's a critique of a classical or traditional notion of form that he's making. He's saying the theory of individuation, or indeed of ontogenesis, is what we need to replace that classical notion, which of course he critiques specifically in terms of the hylomorphic schema. But blah, blah, blah. The fact that he is talking about the whole scope of his project and Jung is right there in the center and he's presenting that to a bunch of heavy hitters suggests to me that Jung is really a primary influence, primary
Yeah.
inspiration. Yeah.
And Jung on alchemy,
Yes, indeed.
um, where, there was something you said in your talk this past weekend about Simondon's notion of the pre-individual, and he has these series of domains or phases, I guess, of individuation: the physical, the vital, the psychic, the trans-individual or collective. But he says that I mean, correct me if I mischaracterize this in my notes, but physical individuation could be more easily construed, if not fully correctly construed, as a kind of once and done thing. Like crystallization occurs and then you have your crystal. That crystal doesn't exchange energy with its environment. It's just sort of there as a structure. Whereas in vital, but especially in psychic and collective systems, there's always this relationship to the pre-individual
Yeah.
as a result of what you referred to as neotenization. So neoteny being the tendency for in the development of some organisms, like the difference between a human and an ape is that the human maintains neoteny much longer
So
into
maintenance of
development.
maintenance of juvenile character states for either an extended period or into adulthood, essentially.
Right. And this reminded me a lot of a diagram I shared with you that, maybe I can pull up in a second. But also the importance of alchemy, though, seems to me to be suggesting that even in physical individuation, it's not a once and done thing, and that there are ways of potentiating materiality such that you can see the vital and the psychic spilling out of it without there needing to be some kind of ontological gap there. So ontogenesis is deeper. Uh, non-axiomatizable, this deeper process of individuation that can't be axiomatized, which seems very important to Simondon, uh, is is present at all these different phases. But I think even in the physical, and again, this is why the example of alchemy is so significant, the pre-individual, the neotenization, the juvenile maintenance of some connection to the pre-individual is still there, even in physical structures, right? Otherwise, alchemy wouldn't work in the way that the magnum opus is claimed to work. Um, but a few sessions after your presentation at the Jung conference, I saw this diagram that Jung used in the 20s. Let me pull it up here, uh, where he's talking about the central fire that's at the base um, of everything, and then there are these different layers going up to the individual psyche at the very tip, um, with then family, clan, nation, large group like Europe, for example, primitive ancestors, animal ancestors in general, and then again at the bottom, the central fire. But there's this lava tube that goes right up to the individual, meaning that the pre-individual is always still, there's this neotenous connection
Yeah.
to the pre-individual field, if you want, that goes all the way through these layers of sedimentation um, that would seem to uh, disconnect us from that. Um, but that maintenance of a connection to the central fire in Jung's terms or to the pre-individual in Simondon's terms seems essential to any uh, evolutionary ontology or any account of ontogenesis, which maybe are equivalent ways of saying the same thing.
So,
Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I'm curious what you make of the connection to alchemy and if you agree with the way that I'm kind of unpacking that.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And of course, I think one of the key notions here is the reference to de-differentiation or
Hmm.
the dissolution in that discussion of alchemy that Simondon mentions. And so, yeah, it's complicated with physical individuation because Simondon will say, so he'll say that there's a domain of knowledge of the physical and a domain of knowledge of the living, but there's not in the same sense a real domain of the physical and a real domain of the living separated by an equally real boundary. The physical and the vital are distinct according to structures and functions without being separate according to the substantial real. So, I mean, his philosophy in general is an anti-substantialism, right? So there's no substantial distinction between like physical and vital. There's no substantial distinction between, mind and body or whatever. But there are real distinctions, but they are operational, functional, etc. As opposed to substantial and indeed structural. So he does say, physical individuation is considered as an individuation that jumps the gun, that does not sufficiently remain in suspense at its origin. And vital individuation would be like a dilation of the inchoate stage that makes possible an organization, a deepening of the extreme beginning. And I do think this is a very fascinating and useful way, or like the whole neotenization paradigm, which maybe we'll get into a bit more if I share some slides on that. Um, is a fascinating way to think about these operational distinctions. But I think that you're right, and I think it's still consistent with Simondon that even in the broadly speaking physical, um, there is something akin to neotenization, or there is an ongoingness to ontogenesis. And so, Simondon's very famous for, which I didn't, I think, talk about in this, Jung Simondon talk at all, and maybe pointedly because I'm just sick of hearing about it. But it is a great one of his schemas, one of his paradigms, which is a great one and very intuitive, is crystallization. Um, and so people often think of that as the model of individuation in Simondon, or certainly the model of physical individuation. But he has, quite different things to say about quantum mechanics. There's a huge discussion of quantum mechanics in the Ilfie book,
Mm.
and in which he's moving towards a conception of the individual, or individuality, let's say. And there's an interesting distinction between individuation and individualization in Simondon. Simondon is nothing if not, you know, complicated. Um, but individuality is in fact I would call it a function class if I was going to use terms from evolutionary biology. So like, I work on venom and poisons and things like that, right? Venom is a function class, right? So when we group together the venom of like scorpions and the venom of snakes, like when we say venom, it's not because they are homologous structures in nature, right? Um, there's no relationship between the evolution of a venom system in a scorpion and the evolution of a venom system in snakes. Now, this doesn't preclude them recruiting some members of the same gene families to act as toxins. Nature is nothing if not complicated and interesting. But the scorpion telson with which it stings and the snake fangs and all that, totally obviously unrelated structures, but they are convergent in structure and function, right? So they do the same thing. So venom is that class of poisons which is introduced to a target organism via a physical means, like injected, for the purposes of, basically deterring or subduing the target animal, right? And that's the same between scorpions and snakes. And that is the sense in which they're both venomous. And so venom is a function class. Wings are a function class. Eyes are a function class. These are very intuitive um, examples. And so individuality is like a function class in Simondon. It's a mode of interaction. Um,
Mm.
so it's like a relational mode. Um, and so when he's speaking about quantum mechanics, that starts to become really vivid, right? So that he talks a lot about complementarity and wave particle duality and that sort of stuff, and the particle as the individuated aspect of such a system is a mode of interaction between systems. So this also, of course, just dovetails with the notion that individuation is always relational, like in all domains. But and so in that case, there's no sense that, the let's say the field is individuating into a particle and that's the end of individuation in some sense, right? That's not the case in quantum mechanics really at all. It's that these are different operational modalities depending on the regime or the milieu, depending on what's going on. And there will be ways to make that really evocative with like detailed, worked quantum mechanical examples, and Simondon has his, and then there are many others that we could look at. I mean, one of the things that I've been doing a little bit, which I'm not necessarily prepared to speak on with great lucidity this morning, but is a Simondonian account of what's known as spontaneous parametric down conversion in quantum mechanics. So when you've got like a highly charged photon, like in the ultraviolet spectrum, and it gets fired at a nonlinear crystal, and it potentially enters into a certain kind of resonance with the crystal and is um, best thought of as transforming as a result of that resonance into a Bell state, which is kind of a superposition. So it's kind of it's like a de-differentiation in a way, right? You've got this photon, but it's a high energy photon. It then is transformed into something that's more pre-individual in some sense, this superposition of states. And then through measurement, you can decohere that superposition into two lower energy, like an entangled pair of two lower energy photons. And so just to say that this is like a cool example of it going back and forth in some sense, it's like the so-called pump photon at the beginning is, thought of at least modeled as individuated, then it goes into this more pre-individual like state, the Bell state, and then subsequent to another interaction, it's re-individuated if you want, or that coherent superposition decoheres and you get the two individual
Right.
as a result. I should also just say that crystallization even though in the interior of the crystal, this is the key distinction between the vital and the physical when he's using the crystallization metaphor. In the interior of the crystal, it's basically of course it's vibratory, but it's basically a structured lattice. And individuation per se, which is the transformation of the metastable milieu into the crystalline form, is happening just on the edge of the crystal.
Mm.
This can happen, unlike in a living system, right, where that's also happening internally. This can happen ostensibly indefinitely. Like if you just keep the conditions right, if you maintain the gradient in that supersaturated, fluid, that the mother liquor of the crystal, you can grow a crystal in a potentially open-ended way. So internally, it's going to be essentially fixed. Um, so that's the sense in which physical individuation has jumped the gun. But on its boundaries, it can grow ostensibly for forever. And this would become also his paradigmatic example of the nature of transduction, the nature of the relationship between past and future. All sorts of fascinating things can emerge. Like what's amazing and cool about Simondon is that he will take all of these different paradigms and he just through his analogical method, he's making so many different connections, which I think are very compelling, especially for those of us who like to think in sort of generalized evolutionary terms. And we think we are really tracking an ontology or Simondon would of course say ontogenesis is prior to ontology, but an ontogenetic conception of reality here. Like it's not simply our lack of imagination that makes the say the psychological or the cognitive and transduction in the physical domain seem analogical. That's not just
Yeah.
because we have to understand one thing in terms of another. It's because this is being or the being whose being is becoming, as Simondon would say, is analogical in this way, right?
Mm. So do you think that what Simondon is doing in the physical domain as regards the uh, this process of ontogenesis and this pre-individual fields is akin to these what are called the possibilist approaches in quantum physics, like Epperson's and Michael Epperson's and Ruth Kastner's, and this idea of res potentiae that um, Stu Kaufman and Kastner and Epperson have developed, where it's a say, is that a specific application or example of what Simondon is talking about at the physical level, um, bringing possibility back into our ontology of nature, more or less?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I think that those approaches are extremely resonant with Simondon, both in terms of the reality of possibility,
Mhm.
and also in terms of the relational nature of say individuation or the achievement of form or discrete structures is a consequence of a relational interaction.
Mhm.
So you can definitely find, and obviously they're going to be different, and the differences between, say, like a Ravelli type relational quantum mechanics and the kinds of approaches you just talked about, there are real differences there. But
Right.
there are also going to be resonances with Simondon's philosophy. Like, I mean, one difference there would be that I think, Ravelli essentially is preserving unitarity,
Yeah.
whereas, the relativistic transactional approach doesn't treat unitarity as a sacred cow. I mean, we'd be getting too far off topic here, but one of my criticisms of Simondon in his very long and fascinating discussion of quantum mechanics is that he ultimately never sees unitarity as a target. He doesn't even mention, unitarity. He talks about, the contrast between deterministic and indeterministic approaches in quantum mechanics, and he talks about, determinism and indeterminism as both limit concepts, and reality is somewhere in. It's not that. I mean, those are both real, but that things are often some mixture of the two. Blah blah blah, and it's
Yeah.
all very good and very fascinating. But what he misses is that in the formalisms of quantum mechanics, they generally all the different approaches preserve unitary evolution in the sense that they're all ultimately preserving the coherence of some fundamental predefined space, phase space. And I think that the transactional interpretation is one of the few that is willing to really, I mean, to give possibility such a realistic treatment that the landscape of possibility itself is changed in interactions, right?
Mhm.
So it's not
Great.
always the possibilities to chord are predefined, and then only some subset of them is actualized. It's that there is a real construction of adjacent possibility, which is a feedback, like what
Yeah.
has happened feeds back on what is possible and genuinely kind of restructures
Right.
it.
And as Stu Kaufman's always saying, he's usually referring to biological evolution, that the future states are unprestatable. But I think in Kaufman's work with these two physicists or philosophers of physics, like Everson and Ruth Kastner, that idea is extended beyond just biology, to escape this Laplacian paradigm. Um,
Yeah, because in the just to say in the Laplacian paradigm, you have unprestatability, but it's a function of ignorance essentially, right?
sure.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
so,
It's
so
epistemic, not ontological. But they're saying
yeah,
this is real possibility. These are
yeah,
ontologically, even
yeah.
God couldn't know them in advance of the process of actualization or individuation. Um, which, well, let's not get into our um, mm, usual disputes about Whitehead's theology yet.
Maybe we can get there towards the
We'll
end.
get
Yeah.
there. But maybe you can say more about the connections to Jung's thought, as particularly Jung's use of his appropriation of this Gnostic idea of the Pleroma, um,
Hmm. Hmm.
where it's both a nothingness but also a fullness.
Yeah.
It's eternal but also endless process, never the same twice, etc. And how that relates to Simondon's idea of the pre-individual.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe I'll share my slides in just a second, and so people can see some of the relevant quotes.
Hmm.
Um, I did want to before we move on from the volcano, actually, just for fun, to read a quick passage from the Red Book as well
Oh,
on
sure.
on volcanoes, and on because it's relevant to de-differentiation in a big way as well. It's an amazingly evocative account of de-differentiation, or what might be called in the psychic register, psychic catabasis as I often like to put it. And then, I
Mhm.
mean, as far as the relevance of there's a relevance of Jung for Simondon, which is this, genuine influence that Simondon does signal. There's also what is the relevance of Simondon for Jung. So why should I mean that sounds normative. Why might people invested in Jung take an interest in Simondon, and I think that's something we should get to. We'll pursue what you were suggesting first, but in my talk, those slides on method kind of intervene before we get to the pleroma. Hang
Mm.
on, yeah, let me just have a quick look at this. So in the Red Book Reader's Edition, right? Because the other edition, which is amazing and beautiful, is just unreadable because it's like massive and heavy. Um, Page 178 to 179, if people are interested. Um, you sent me that picture from that talk, and then yesterday I was looking at my notes for my talk, and I found the reference to this passage in Jung, and I was going to bring this up as an example of de-differentiation and the ongoing relationship with the pre-individual, but it just didn't make it into the talk because there was way too much content. But so Jung talks about this mystery play that he witnessed in these, in this practice of incubation or active imagination, or as he described it evocatively, doing a schizophrenia, which that's what he said, isn't it? Doing a yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, which led to, the black books and then ultimately the red book. I mean, there's some really important stuff. This is more like Jung stuff than Jung Simondon stuff. But, this play that I witnessed is my play, not your play. It's my secret, not yours. You cannot
Mhm.
imitate me. My secret remains virginal and my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you. You have your own. And I mean, this is so important for Jung's method overall.
Mhm.
Why he didn't want followers, but he also didn't want his let's say map of the psyche, and indeed there is a series of books called Jung's Map of the Psyche, and many such things. He didn't want that to be reified. I think he's
Yeah.
pretty clear about that. It's like, I need a map, but this is my map,
But so do you. Make
yeah,
your
yeah,
own.
exactly.
Yeah.
And again, what's really important, and maybe we'll get to that because there's a Simondonian inflection of things Jung says about psychotherapy. But what's really important when you're encountering the particular individual in front of you in psychotherapy for Jung is that you don't engage with them through those a priori,
Mhm.
filters of your schema, of your metaphysics, or this is why he doesn't do metaphysics, right? Because he thinks that he would inevitably end up projecting that onto his patients. And he's like, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be
Mhm.
entering into mutual, reciprocal. So when we get to Simondon and the trans individual, the psychotherapeutic encounter for Jung is a trans individual individuation. And I think that I think so much of Jung's thought proceeds from that. And I just think that's so important to always remember. It's like that encounter between, you know, people, psyches, um, in psychotherapy is just so crucial for Jung. But anyway, when he describes this is just really beautiful. He describes the mystery play. And I've got notes here like Simondon, of course, Empedocles, lots of things about resonances with Deleuze and Guattari as well. De-differentiation, deterritorialization.
Mhm.
Um, the scene of the mystery play is a deep place like the crater of a volcano. My deep interior is a volcano that pushes out the fiery, molten mass of the unformed and undifferentiated. Thus, my interior gives birth to the children of chaos, of the primordial mother. He who enters the crater also becomes chaotic matter. He melts. The formed in him dissolves and binds itself anew with the children of chaos. I mean, this is just a directly parallel description with the one that Simondon makes of Jung's discovery of the alchemical schema, right? This is a discussion of de-differentiation, of a renewed relationship with what he's calling here the primordial mother. So, of course, we could get into a discussion of Cora and other things that you and I love.
Right.
But these powers stretch beyond my certainties and my limits on all sides and connect me with all forms and all distant beings and things. They're numinous, right? They're excessive. There's so much amazing stuff in Simondon, which we'll hopefully get to, about the numinosity of images,
Mm.
which is
Yeah.
very, very Jungian, right?
Right.
Because I've fallen into the source of chaos, into the primordial beginning, I myself become smelted anew in the connection with the primordial beginning, which at the same time is what has been and what is becoming. I
Mm.
am part of the matter and formation of the world, so I also come into the primordial beginning of the world itself, right? So we discover in our own de-differentiation, something genuinely primordial. This is something that some Simondonians would be a little bit resistant to, actually, but I'm going to give the quote in just a minute on pre-phasic being, because we're getting to the Pleroma. This is taking us to the Pleroma, even though this means I'm going to be talking for far too long, as I usually am. Anyway, he goes on, and I won't go on about it. He talks about Prometheus. He talks about all a bunch of stuff. And then there's all this stuff about the serpent on the next page as the mediator between forethinking and pleasure. The Red Book is just this endlessly generative thing to read. If you read it in that kind of open analogical register, like it's self problematic and underdetermined, right? Like reading it in some literalist way. I mean, you can read it as literature and it's fun, it's full of evocative images, but reading it in some literalist way doesn't really get us very far. It's full of contradictions, obviously. But there are such evocative images that then we can link to these analogically to these broader processes described by Jung, but also by Simondon. So shall I share my screen? Um, or do
You
you want
should be able to. I was just, what you were saying there reminds me, what Jung is saying reminds me a lot of Schelling's line in Ages of the World, where Jason Worth translates it as Schelling saying that the human soul is conscientious of creation and of the origin of creation. That in other words, the lava tubes coming up from the central fire right into the
Yeah,
heart of our psyche, but often, almost always, thankfully repressed or kept at the subliminal stage, because otherwise we'd all be massively overcome by messiah complexes constantly, probably.
yeah. I mean, or we would just dissolve
Yeah,
into nothingness in some
yeah.
sense.
We do a schizophrenia.
Yeah, exactly. Or worse, we would just melt, right? Like if all the differentiated structure in us, de-differentiated, that's just, yeah, called melting. Um,
Oops. Sorry, that was not what I wanted to share. I wanted to just, before you share, just quickly show Jung's painting of this.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's on. That's going to be on my slide as well.
Oh, good. Yeah.
In the
Uh,
serp.
anyways, please go on and you should be able to share your screen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So there is a lot of text on these slides, which um, continue to share, which can be difficult. And anyone watching, anyone listening, don't worry, you're not going to be missing too much. And anyone watching, don't necessarily try to read the whole thing, but you can look at the references there. You can contact me or Matt. I don't know if Matt has it, but I can give it to him.
I have the
Um,
slides.
yeah, well, either for the slides or also for a PDF of ILFI itself. ILFI being individuation in light of notions of form in information, where some of these come from. So this is something I've actually read on our discussions before, but this is one of Simondon's most evocative descriptions of pre-phasic being, which in some sense is like the pre-individual as such. The pre-individual shows up in different domains, in different domains of individuation in different ways. And we can talk about all the empirical analogs of the pre-individual. That's in some sense, work that's very close to my heart, but I'm extrapolating a little bit from Simondon. But I mean, one of the things that's important to say, though, about that thing in Schelling and what Jung was saying, and then what Simondon's going to be saying here is that, when we are encountering in ourselves this, undifferentiated mass, and we have all these evocative of terms, the primordial mother, the children of chaos, all of this stuff that Jung was talking about. What we're encountering is a limit. And it's important to understand that we're encountering a limit. So when we're talking about like the absolutely primordial or something, we're thinking cosmogenesis, which is what Simondon is explicitly doing at this point, which I'm about to read. It's not that we're trying to figure something determinate. It's not that we're trying to really put any positive content into that image. We are speaking about the limit of thought, the limit of our capacity to determine being or determine the nature of being, right? And what we're saying is that this limit is immanent to thought, and thus, in some sense, if we think thought is part of being, and we have this analogical relationship between thought and being, which is what Schelling's also talking about. We're saying this is an immanent limit to being, and really what we're just encountering is indeterminacy or the limit of our capacity to determine being, as I said. And so Simondon definitely does act as though, speak as though being is determinable to the extent that thought is. Thought is determinable to the extent that being is, right? So there's an analogical relationship here. It's not an idealism, but it's an analogical relationship. I would call it a transcendental empiricism, and we can get into that in a moment. But so anyway, he says the prime mover, if we're thinking cosmogenesis in some sense, is not the simple and singular being. So it's not substance as something that's simple, unitary, one, etc. But the being insofar as it is anterior to any appearance of phases, harboring them energetically, yet not as forms or structures that can come forth. Right. So it's not differentiated, but it harbors phases in a kind of anticipatory way. But not as forms or structures that can come forth. Because if you say there are forms or structures that can come forth, if you think of virtuality, Simondon will also say, as a bunch of, predefined forms and structures that just are waiting to be to be ingressed, but are waiting to be actualized, then you've already presupposed that differentiation. And he's saying ontogenesis is the process of differentiation. Actualization is what we're trying to talk about here. We're trying to talk about a coming to definiteness. Definiteness. All right. In the same way as the position of the problem, in certain sense, bears the possible solution as attention toward a signification that incorporates the data of the problem. So problems have an orientation towards solutions, but they are not in themselves solutions, albeit without the prior formation of the effective lines of the solution, which would only appear through the real becoming of resolutive invention, and which are this becoming, right? So you have to go through this process of individuation to solve the problematic tension of the pre-individual. Thus, the capacity of resolutive becoming is contained in the being before any becoming through the incompatibility that it will be able to make compatible. If people know their Jung, think about the transcendent function perhaps at this point, but not the line of this becoming's existence, which is not already given and cannot be preformed since the problematic is without phases. So there's no vector here, there's no telos basically. The line of this becoming's existence is not preformed before it happens, okay? Anti-preformationism all the way. It also means that archetypes themselves must individuate, right? Archetypes can't be, eternally individuated things per se. So according to the doctrine we're presenting, being is never one. This is Simondon again. When it's monophasic, pre-individual, it is more than one. It is one in the sense that it appears like one now because it's non-decomposed. So it's unified, but only because it's undifferentiated, right? Um, for a
Mhm.
dynamic for a dynamic differentiating being as becoming, there's no simple unity. And then this is super important here. Um, as for you already referenced this. As for the axiomatization of the knowledge of pre-individual being, it cannot be contained in a preliminary logic. Like you can't set the state space and blah 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 up in advance as a kind of Laplacian effective theory, which is really that's how physicalism works in general. That's how physical theory works in general, is by setting the preliminary logic. It's axiomatic. Um, Here, for no normal system detached from its content can be defined. We cannot therefore have an immediate knowledge or a mediated knowledge of individuation, but we can have a knowledge that is an operation parallel to the operation known. We cannot know individuation in the ordinary sense of the term. You can't contain it in like a propositional knowledge, is basically what he's saying, because it's dynamic. It can't be contained in some static preliminary logic or presupposition. Um, you can have an operation parallel. You can individuate along with the individuation of whatever, system you're studying, right? We cannot know individuation in the ordinary sense of the term, which would be propositional knowledge. We can only individuate, be individuated, and individuate within ourselves. Beings can be known through the knowledge of the subject, so beings can be known through the knowledge of the subject. So you can know, that's ontology. You can know a being, which is in some sense like an individuated structure. But the individuation of beings, i.e., the genesis of those structures, can only be grasped through the individuation of the subject's knowledge. All right, so you can only know individuation by individuating, basically. Right, and I've just got a note here. Individuation is relational. Knowledge is sympathetic. Knowledge of individuation is sympathetic individuation. And I've put a note for the Jungians. Consider the relationship between analyst and analysand here, and I do have quotes on that later. But okay, the Pleroma. Do you want me to jump into the Pleroma, or do you want to talk about pre-phasic being first?
Well, in terms of pre-phasic being, I mean, on the one hand, uh, I think Simondon and I assume you would really want to avoid any parallels to something like the Platinian one. But in the one, as Plotinus intends its meaning, it's beyond being. It's not unity as or one as a member of a class of other
Yeah,
ones, and it's beyond unity in a categorical sense. It's more like but Plotinus would describe it as simple,
yeah,
rather than just as pure differentiation or difference in itself or something, as I think Simondon and then Deleuze would want to render it. But in terms of the one as beyond being, the one as beyond any sense of unity as a category, or as a accountable number,
yeah.
how how different, where is the difference, from that concept of the one or that anti-concept of the one? If I mean, because for Plotinus we can only directly mystically intuit that and
Yeah.
contemplatively identify ourselves with it rather than even think it. Thinking happens after it's already overflowed itself.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that there is a lot in common, uh, especially if we, unpack, the more, I guess, process relational aspects of the thought of someone like a Plotinus. Um, and it's going to get interesting also when we go into the discussion of the Pleroma, I think, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, I guess there's a whole genealogy of the notion of the one, which we've talked about when we talked about the Timaeus and how in the Parmenides, the Platonic dialogue, the Parmenides, the one is created to solve the problem of the relationship between the forms and the demiurge. And that is also the problem that Simondon is solving, or attempting to, right? Which is the hylomorphic problem in some sense, the
Hmm.
division between, sorry, not the forms and the I mean the forms demiurge and chora. So the relationship between, forms demiurge and that which is informed or shaped or molded, this, supposedly passive matter. This is the problem that Simondon is addressing, and he's saying that those are, I mean, he's obviously critiquing the artisanal model and all of that, whilst giving us a very, very detailed study of indeed artisanal and technical practices, both in, of course, the technical objects book and this book. But he's saying that the problem of this mediation, um, the relationship between those terms only exists when we start from the extreme terms, which are actually the
Mm.
consequence of this ontogenetic process. And they are like a coarse-grained schema for how we think about these things. But in a sense, you could say, although again, Simondon will have his reasons for resisting this image of unity or one, there is no primordial schism between form and matter, because they are part of a single system from the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
But Simondon will want to say that um, the notion of oneness and unity and all that is associated with substance. Um, and it's associated with something. And he's really, he's of course critiquing Laplace and all these things all simultaneously. His image of Spinoza, which a lot of Spinozists would disagree with. Um, but he's basically saying that this notion of the one is something that is essentially preformed and sort of static because it's not at odds with itself. Simondon is saying like
But the
pre-individual.
Platonian account of it is because it overflows, it is at odds with itself in some sense, at least as far as we can
Is it?
encounter and
Is
understand
it?
it.
Yeah. Well, is it?
Why
At
else
least,
would there be a universe? Why
well,
else is there anything that differentiates if it's this is a paradox in Plotinus too. I'm not, and also, in the Parmenides, Plato doesn't so much solve this problem. He that ends in aporia like most of the
yeah, yeah,
dialogues.
yeah.
He
This is this.
problematizes his own solution.
Yeah, and this is the thing that Simondon is specifically intervening in. He's
Mhm.
specifically saying that it is at odds with itself. Like you can
Yeah.
ask a question, why would you, from your, process relational 21st century perspective, are asking the question, why would it overflow? Why would there be creation and all these things? That's what Simondon is saying. Simondon is saying, like, if the thing were just one, like was some kind of simple harmonious unity, that would not occur. In
Yeah.
fact, its primary characteristic is its tension, it's simultaneous. It's like the many one, as we've discussed with Catherine Keller. You can think of it as kind of it's all together in some sense, right? But it is also at odds with itself, though not differentiatedly so. And that's key, right? Like it
Yeah.
doesn't contain discrete states. It's got no contradiction in it per se. And
Mm.
that's why Simondon says his scheme is not dialectical, because
Yeah.
the dialectics, the contradiction pre-exists the movement of
Right.
synthesis.
Right.
Whereas Simondon is saying, like, no, there isn't a pre-existing contradiction, but there is a kind of what he would call a disparation. There is a tension. Um, and he thinks that they're subtle interventions, but he thinks that they make kind of all the difference. And
Mm.
he's very worried about our tendency in thought to confuse the coarse-grained achievement of let's say rational thought or whatever, but the different, which is itself this process of individuation, but basically to confuse the individual, the achieve or the individuated concept, the achievement of ontogenesis with its precondition. And he's specifically just poking at the edges of
Mm.
those things and saying, no, 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 these can't be a precondition because they're already individuated. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean it's occurring to me that really Whitehead's wrong about footnotes to Plato in some sense. It's Parmenides that sets the agenda for the history of Western philosophy in responding to the proposition being is, and
yeah,
how does thought think that absolute identity and
yeah,
or oneness. And Zeno applies this idea to motion and ends up having to say, well, intellectually speaking, for thought, there's no way the arrow can reach the target. It just can't happen. Obviously, it does in our experience. And so it creates this gap between experience of the sensory world and our intellectual contemplation of this ultimate absolute simplicity or unity. And then,
Yeah.
Plotinus wrestles with that issue and ends up saying, well, thought just can't reach it. Thought reaches a limit, and but he claimed, or at least after I think four experience of it, mystical experiences of it, that well, what can we say? It's not that there is the oneness that's already to subject it to or identify it with being. It's beyond being. It's
Yeah.
not a substance, but it's a what? A pre-individuated field, maybe.
Look, I think you can definitely give, Plotinus. I mean, it's a little bit like, Jack Bagby's readings of Aristotle, right? And I mean, I'm not the Aristotle scholar. I'm not going to challenge his reading in terms of what Aristotle was really saying, but I
Yeah,
know a lot of Aristotle scholars would. But that incredibly beautiful, dynamic reading of Aristotle, which essentially makes Aristotle, and I mean, Simondon is very well disposed to Aristotle. It's kind of a misconception, like he's critiquing the holomorphic schema and blah blah blah, but it's a misconception that he's critiquing Aristotle per se. He's Aristotle is a very important, like kind of mediatory thinker for him always.
yeah,
Um, but whether or not, like, there's a way in which you listen to Jack talk about Aristotle, and it's incredibly beautiful. And I mean, Jack has a number of books that he's referencing, which I'd love to read, but like contemporary recent studies on Aristotle, and it's like, oh, Aristotle is already Simondonian, right?
yeah,
And it almost becomes an imp, especially from my position of just not having that familiarity with Aristotle. Um, and mostly my own readings of Aristotle have been shaped by a certain received opinion, which is like a scholasticization of Aristotle, right?
yeah,
Um, so I couldn't adjudicate, obviously, and wouldn't pretend to about whether that dynamic Aristotle is more the real Aristotle or something like that. But it is to the point that we were discussing yesterday. Um, it is very clear that Simondon is in this tradition, right? So even the fact that you could hypothetically, and I'm not saying this is what's happening at all either, but you could read Aristotle through Simondon, just as you can read Jung through Simondon. Well, I mean, who is it? Who is Simondon responding to? He talks about Aristotle all the time. He talks about Plato all the time. He's talks about Spinoza and many others, and he does definitely straw man some of these people. There's no question.
mm,
Um, but he uses them to characterize their conceptual personae in the Deleuzian sense. He uses them to characterize particular strands of Western thought, or
yeah,
common ways of thinking, right? And those ways of thinking themselves may be bastardizations of Spinoza or Plotinus or you know um, Plato or whatever. But Simondon is a Western philosopher, like he's in this tradition. I of course
mhm,
agree with what you're saying about Parmenides. I think a lot of people have said, Parmenides is kind of the origin of Western philosophy in some very important way. Um, or of the dominant strand of Western philosophy. And obviously, Plato, as we discussed when we're talking about the Timaeus, he's already trying to uh, provide an image which takes what he thinks is the best from other pre-Socratics with Parmenides, obviously with Pythagorean imagery and etc. Like he's already doing some kind of, for lack of a bit, well, integration or syncretic almost
yeah,
approach to philosophy, right? And so of course that makes his texts endlessly generative, and that's why philosophy is footnotes to Plato, right? Just in the sense that he's got the Parmenidean insight, but he's also, when he discusses the Cora, it's more Anaximander, or who again, Simondon is always referencing Anaximander, like
mm,
the pre-individual is specifically analogized with the apeiron. Um,
yeah,
and of course,
mm,
you could say that, Simondon is in the lineage of Heraclitus if you wanted, because he's a process thinker and whatever. Whenever we make that kind of move, we obviously coarse grain, the history, the rhizomatic history of influences in Western philosophy when we try to say this is the mighty ancestor of this particular lineage of thinking. They're all,
Mm.
there's so much cross-pollination going on, right?
Is there any parallel, and then maybe this can fold into your uh, comparison of the pleroma to the pre-individual, but is there any a concept in Simondon's work that would be comparable to Heraclitus's logos in terms of an organizing I don't want to say principle because that makes it seem like
Yeah.
there's not that in Simondon, but I mean the logos as a process of differentiation and reintegration. I think in as a gathering and then a dispersal, the ongoing, process of creative organization. Is there anything like that in Simondon? And if not, um, when he says that we can't axiomize, we can't come up with a set of axioms that or principles that would allow us to come up with, say, a categorical a set of categories by which we could then understand individuation, because that the knowledge itself is, as you were saying, a process of
Mhm.
individuation, and it's never going to reach some foundational set of concepts, um, or categories or axioms. um, why are we even doing, not that we need to do philosophy that way. That's not the only,
Mm.
way of doing philosophy, but why are we trying to apply and come up with a rational account if there isn't something like a logos
Yeah.
organizing and ordering
Yeah.
cosmogenesis?
Yeah, well, he's definitely trying to come up with, for lack of a better term, a unified conception of being as becoming, right? He's saying that,
Hmm.
it's to just, use the Salesian term, it's like how to hang together. That's
Right.
the encyclopedic method, which is his, and the analogical method, actually, both aspects of his method, which we haven't really talked about,
Mm.
um, are absolutely about trying to understand how all of these diverse manifestations of becoming are related in a way that you could describe as systematic or systemic, right? So being is a system that proliferates systems in some sense, right? It's a
Mm.
heterogenetic system. Um, what he's trying to be really, really careful to avoid, and sometimes I think, so he says there's no principle of individuation that you could put before the process of individuation, right? Sometimes I think it's nice to think of principle, even though it is the IPLE principle, but the IPAL principle, in the sense that there's no individuated thing or set of things that comes before individuation itself. If you're
Mm.
already in the domain, and of course it's going to be very, the logos, um, that's a very polysemous term, right? And I think we would have to be very careful in the way we were analyzing that, um, because is it a pre-existing sort of order, or is it? So I mean, you specifically said of like de-differentiation and differentiation. That of course, if you're already in that highly dynamic
Mhm.
perspective where you're not actually speaking about content, so much as you're speaking about a dynamic process that gives rise to content. And so, we could speak of a Darwin Peirce Lewontin triad, as I always do here, something like
Mhm.
variation, selection, and inheritance, right?
Yeah.
Um, and,
Yeah. I mean, to say logos is a uh, semantic term is, I think it's polysemic, and it's the term that is meant to signify the possibility of signification or semiosis itself, So it's a very, rather than having specific content, it's like we refer to a term like logos in this lineage, that we're all thinking within. And maybe we could make translations to other, to Chinese thought and talk about the Tao. And there's been a lot of interesting work linking what Heraclitus meant by logos to what, Taoists would mean by, the nameless. And so, but it's given a name in the West. We call it logos, and it's before, I think, specific meanings. It's the very capacity for there to be meaning. It's the very condition for the possibility of meaning, perhaps we could say.
Simondon is extremely concerned with meaning. He's
Mhm.
extremely concerned with the genesis of signification. And of course, he's concerned with logos. And he even wants us to be very careful when we use a term like technology to
Mm.
recognize the existence of the logos root in that. So, technology is not the set of technical objects. Technology is the study, in fact, of technicity, of technical being, of the genesis of technical objects. It is not technical objects themselves. And he's concerned that we tend to use the term technology to mean that set of technical objects. So, I mean, of course, you can find a way. I mean, it's the central concern of Simondon's thought. I think it's justifiable to say is that, logoi, or the possibility of logos. I don't want to say the logos, or
Right.
because that would be to suggest a predeterminate order that structures everything. Simondon
Mhm.
is talking about a process, and trying to talk about it in some sense in the vaguest possible terms at the beginning. So this is what I would think about as kind of a minimization approach in speculative philosophy, and a diagrammatic approach. That's the analogical approach.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, you were talking in your Jung presentation about how thought for Simondon is always mediating
yeah,
um, between domains, and it's mediating through the application of operations
yeah,
that are analogous,
mhm,
uh, that connect
yeah,
those domains. And that mediating role is precisely how I would want to understand logos. But there is definitely a reading of the logos as a kind of prior uh, uh, logical principle that determines everything that would then be actualized, and that's, I think, a reading that would need to be problematized. And I think Jung's whole reading of, his answer to Job and in Ion, and his understanding of this archetype of Christ that in the West, in the biblical tradition at least, is identified with the Logos. Jung is problematizing that reading because it's Logos is there signifying the need for even the divine uh,
yeah,
to transform in the course of history in relationship, just like that psychoanalytic encounter, between analyst and analyst, and the
yeah,
encounter
yeah,
between God and the world and the creature ends up
exactly.
transforming the divine. And the logos is precisely how the tradition has um, signified that mutual transformation.
Yeah, yeah, no, beautiful. And I think, of course, for you who are you're so deeply informed by process relational thought, um, your conception of the logos is going to be very similar to what Simondon's doing. But
Mhm.
Simondon's critique is of what he would think of as a dominant perspective in Western thought,
Yeah,
which might be linked with monotheism, might
yeah.
also be linked with effective theory and sort of Laplacian paradigms. Those are not Simondon's particular targets of critique explicitly. Like those are my terms, but
Mhm.
those are his targets, but those are not the terms that he's using.
Yeah.
Um,
But logos as mediators is precisely in the way that Simondon is thinking of thought as playing this mediating role
yeah,
between domains. I think is where, even in the uh, biblical tradition, logos is a mediator,
yeah,
mediating between um, the creator and the creature in a sense. And so there's, I think, ways of reading the tradition against its own excesses and anxious pursuits of foundations and substantial beings.
to the extent that logos means order, uh, that order just has to be something that arises as a consequence of process relational
Mm-hmm.
dynamics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So things are together and can be understood to be, ordered. Um, but that has been a consequence of their genesis, and a consequence essentially of their togetherness, which is an always already togetherness, because in the pleroma, or the pre-individual, there are no things.
Mm-hmm.
But so, quote unquote, it's a misnomer to say it, everything is together, but that's because those things don't yet exist. They have to be
Yeah.
differentiated out of some shared substrate. And that includes all logic and order and blah, 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 you know? And that's the point that Simondon is really, really trying to hammer home. Um, is
Mm.
that so individuation doesn't proceed where, according to a predefined order where everything finds its place in a predefined matrix, a predefined state, phase, or vector space. That space itself, that matrix itself, that set of ordered relations is generated in the process of differentiation. And that's just the key thing. So effective theory, for example, which takes, which is the foundation of physical theory basically, and takes the pre-existence of a set of states as its fundamental posit. That is a theory about the past for Simondon, right? The past always looks like that because you're looking at the achieve. So it's a deductive slash inductive theory, but it's not transductive or abductive, because the future doesn't look like that. The future remains an open field of not really pre-differentiated, real possibility. And of course, there are degrees of we've talked about this a lot, the construction of adjacent possibles and the relative definiteness of possibilities, which is proportional to their adjacency to what has already been structured, which is what's previously actualized, which is the past. I mean, the past and future stuff is really, really fascinating here, and I've got some quotes for it in the presentation, and we'll get there maybe. Um, but well, yeah, there's slightly too much to say about that. But in the sense, one thing that I like to think, but I have to signal that, my reading of Simondon is my own, and not all Simondonians that I speak to, including my dear friend Jason Tuckwell, who I have, fortnightly meetings about Simondon with, necessarily agree with some of my characterizations. But there is a sense, and maybe this can be a teaser and we'll get there, in which the absolute past, absolute is not a term that we want to use really in this Simondonian context, but the past as limit um, is
Epistemic absolute, perhaps the limit of thought. Yeah.
yeah is pre-phasic being as we've just described it, right?
Mm.
And that's the pre-individual kind of as such. The pre-individual though is always also contemporary, so we're always in relationship with it, as we've discussed. Um, At the same time, if you look far enough into the future, you encounter a limit, which is simply the pre-individual again. Um, so, it's the sense in which you look back far enough, encounter a singularity, encounter the event horizon, look forward far enough, same deal. But also there's the ever-present. I mean, I'm almost quoting Jean Gebser, who's thought I don't know well, the ever-present origin. But
Yeah.
it's like there is the constant presence of that limit, which
Hmm.
is the unpre-canalized, the source of ongoing differentiation, variation as primary in sort of Darwinian terms,
Hmm.
firstness in Peirce's terms. That's always here as
Yeah.
well.
Creativity, and it's what allows each concrescence to be self-creating. Each occasion is self-creating because it recapitulates the original creativity, that is this akin to what, at least I think your friend Tuckwell's account of Simondon as these three orders of ontogenesis, becoming in general. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. And that is the most general characterization then of
mhm.
being. And that's why Simondon will say the being whose being is becoming.
Yeah.
Right. The most general characterization. And that's again why it's not a principle as such. It's
Hmm.
just it's just becoming, or it's just variation if you were in a Darwinian register or a
Yeah.
Peircean register. Or
Yeah.
if you were in a Deleuze register, it's just difference. But there are problems, there are difficulties with each of those um,
Hmm.
ways of describing it, for
There's a
sure.
Simondonian reading of Whitehead, though, where the primordial nature of God as becomes equivalent to, or analogous, I should say, to this limit that we reach at the origin of things, where it's not, Whitehead's metaphysical ground, this notion of the primordial nature. It's an
Yeah.
accident of creativity, but it's the most generic accident because it then, uh, that accident, that uh, that structuring of the space of possible or the field of possibilities or potentialities then gets inherited by all subsequent uh,
Yeah.
actualities, right? And so it's um, we can read that. I would want to read it in the Simondonian way, or the way that would make it compatible with what
I
Simondon is
think
saying.
I think you would. And I think we're obviously very, very close there, you know. So when we've talked in the past about um, the primordial nature as the attractor, we're talking about the spontaneous origin of a primordial attractor selector, essentially, right? And I mean
Mhm.
that is so Simondon is describing that process by analogy with you know various different you know empirical domains from thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, you know biological domain and psychological domain in actually great detail. So he's not saying that it's just absolutely irrational and then and so my obviously my critique of Whitehead, which I don't necessarily want to get into right now, is not that he's not overall got the right kind of picture. It's just that
Mhm.
the way he figures that you know, attractor and its spontaneous generation is, you know, can be poked at a little bit. And so both its kind of absolute irrationality as opposed to it being this kind of, and it's not that this isn't there in Whitehead as well, but this kind of limit that we're constantly encountering, but that we can tarry in that liminal space where we move from the limit into the, you know, um, attractor selector. You know, like we don't have to think of the attractor selector as going in some sense, right? You know, I don't know if that sound comes across, but like popping into existence. Um, but
Yeah.
also, but also that the structure, then the diagram that Whitehead uses to illustrate the primordial nature and its relationship with the eternal objects is still that sort of, you know, broadly speaking, set theoretic structure of effective theory. And I think that's also what we're trying to get beyond a little bit here. So I think that there are just slightly different ways of thinking about that, and they may have different, you know, strengths and weaknesses. There is a sense, as we've discussed, that Whitehead's conception there, in its closeness to the physicalist paradigm of modern science, is a very useful way of putting science and sort of metaphysics into contact, especially as Whitehead continually relativizes the
Yeah.
consequences.
Well,
And it's
there's a pretty all important difference in terms of how laws of physics are usually construed in attempts at grand unifying theories or theories of everything, where Whitehead would view those as completely contingent and emergent, and not
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not
yeah.
what the primordial nature is
No, I
envisaging.
agree. I agree. And of course, importantly, the existence of real possibility, so the non-actual, you know, so the ontology is really different. And so what is really useful there about Whitehead is that he's showing that that kind of diagram, which has its obvious structural, you know,
Mm.
resemblances, um, can be consistent with a very different ontology. So in a
Right.
sense, it's like the fact that your basic set of formal presuppositions works like in physical theory, doesn't actually enable you to decide between these very different ontological options. So you
Mm.
haven't sort of resolved the problems of speculative philosophy through an instrumentalist approach, you know, and that's what Whitehead is showing profoundly there. I mean, Simondon is showing that too, but one of the really useful things about what Whitehead does, I think, is that he shows that a similarly structured, and again at a very abstract diagrammatic level, similarly structured diagram posit
Mm.
can have, you know, be consistent with wildly different ontologies. I mean, that's what we see in quantum mechanics anyway, right? Um, but I think Whitehead is showing us that in a really important way. And there's a
Yeah.
sense in which by like Simondon is slightly eschewing that approach. He's sort of saying that it still would feel to Simondon maybe. Um, and again, like, did Simondon ever read Whitehead? I don't know. There's a lot of resonance between the, and there's no evidence that he did, but whatever. He surely had to be aware of his
Seems
position.
very unlikely that he wouldn't have with Jean Wall and others, in France reading Whitehead at that time. I mean,
Canguilhem mentions Whitehead.
yeah.
Raymond Rouillé obviously is heavily influenced by Whitehead. Simondon could not have failed to be aware of Whitehead. Whether he takes any direct influence is slightly different. Um, But it would have been fascinating had he engaged critically with Whitehead, obviously. But I wonder, and we'll never know what he would have said. But he might have still said that I don't know, that Whitehead is trying to figure too definitely that limit, whilst also then making too indefinite that relationship with the excess or whatever is beyond the limit. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about it. It's a subtle point. Should
Sure.
we should we talk about the pleroma?
Yes, and let's approach where we go next with the understanding that I'm gonna need to eat dinner at some point. So let's prioritize what seems most important for 30 minutes of dialogue. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure, sure. Just
Um,
just to quickly return to, I mean, we will return to Jung in the Pleroma, but this same passage that I was reading from page 178 to 179 in the Red Book,
hmm,
about the de-differentiation and the, going into the volcano. And by the way, I think of that whole allegory, if you want, of Empedocles going
yeah.
into the volcano. About psychic catabasis, essentially, right?
Mhm.
Going to the it's another catabatic myth of going to the underworld. It's a shamanic myth. You cross to the other side, you come back, bearing the knowledge. If you come back at all, I mean, so in
Die
many,
and become, as Goethe would put it.
yeah, exactly. So that's all very consistent. Um, White Jung here talks about the difference between predetermination or forethinking and pleasure, right? And one thing that he says, which I think just resonates with a couple of things we've said, is that forethinking is not power in itself and therefore does not move, but pleasure is power and therefore it moves.
Hmm.
Forethinking needs pleasure to be able to come to form, blah blah blah. So the basic point being that when we talk about whether the one is like some sort of static structure or something that's capable of becoming, if we're making it too similar to, like, forethinking is predictive knowledge, of like determinate outcomes. It's tarrying with like kind of predefined possibilities. And Jung is, I think, very perceptively just saying there that that presupposition of definiteness, if you have that on its own, it cannot become, like, it cannot do anything, right? It's an image of a static
Yeah.
cosmos.
Right. Which I wouldn't. I think the one, as Plotinus understood it, is certainly not static. It's eternal in some sense, but eternal often gets misconstrued as like static and fixed. When I think for the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions, um, somehow Plato's trying to think eternity as imbued with life and motion and eros, and not simply as a crystal, you know. And also in Whitehead, there's a dipolarity to this divine nature. We always have been haggling over the primordial nature, but we can't really understand what Whitehead means by
Yeah.
uh, with his process theology without the consequent nature as well, which is fully bound up in history and becoming and never the same twice and so on. So
No one is going to deny that Whitehead is a process philosopher, even though some might say there are aspects of that static image of being still in his thought. But I guess, again, just to tie it to the Simondon thing, and now we talk about the Pleroma, is that for Simondon, to the extent that there's, an eternal, that's pre-individual. The
yeah,
eternal is indeterminacy is the eternal. And so I like to think about this. I don't like to think about things in terms of like infinities and things where it could be a countable infinity. Like there's enough of this pre-differentiated stuff that we're never going to run out, kind of
mm,
image. We're just talking about ongoingness.
yeah,
You're never gonna run out of something because it's not a quantity. It's not quantifiable. It's just happening. Happening is the net or event or act. The nature of being is act. So it's not going to stop acting.
yeah,
Things can change a lot. Structure can come and go, all of that. But there isn't a limited quantity of action to make use of, right?
yeah.
Uh,
And this is where, Whitehead's only able to work with the tools of set theory in terms of the deep structure of his categorical scheme, even though he's very clear that when he talks about the realm of eternal objects being infinite, he's not talking about a countable
yeah.
infinity, right? Even though set theory would imply that it is.
Mhm.
Um, that's
He's
he doesn't have the formal techniques to actually properly articulate that, even though he's saying in plain language that he doesn't mean accountable infinity, right? So
Yeah.
you're not going to run out of eternal objects, not because there's a whole lot of them, um,
But then
but
that
because
just
it's fecund.
yeah,
Yeah,
no, yeah. No, it's all there. It's just that some of the problems Whitehead has to solve, as I always say,
yeah,
with a sort of, verbal gloss on the formalism are created there, I think, by the formal posit that he's making. And so the problem, the issue there is stemming from the positive predefiniteness of the definiteness of the eternal objects, right?
yeah.
Some degree.
Mhm.
Okay, let's just talk about the pleroma. And then I'll have to have a look at the slides and work out where is good for us. But this is just cool, I think. Um, Pleromatic pre-individuality in Jung. So this is also from the Red Book, but much later in the Red Book, page 509. And this is that part that was, the only part that was published and
Seven sermons
circulated.
to the dead.
Exactly, the seven sermons published and circulated, in Jung's lifetime. Um, so he talks about the pleroma, right? This is not Jung's voice, obviously, this is,
Mhm.
um, but I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as fullness. We call this nothingness or fullness the pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and endless possess no qualities. No one is in it. Right? For he would then be distinct from the pleroma and would possess qualities that would distinguish him as something distinct from the pleroma. There's no differentiation. The pleroma is, my gloss, is pre-individual, pre-definite. Why then do we speak of the pleroma at all, if it is everything and nothing? I speak about it in order to begin somewhere, and also to free you from the delusion that somewhere without or within there is something fixed or in some way established from the outset. Okay, very, very strong anti-prefamationist statement here. Free you from the delusion that somewhere within or without there is something fixed or established from the outset. Every so-called fixed and certain thing is only relative. That alone is fixed and certain, that is subject to change. Okay, this is, change is the only constant, or if you want, the pre-individual is the only eternal. But he's saying in order to begin somewhere, so if you want to think, if you want to speak, if etc., you've got to have a minimal posit, right? We've got to have a posit, and this is an attempt, I think, to define an absolutely minimal posit. But no thing, no differentiated state is eternal. So it's anti-prefamationist. Actualization and creation is the coming to definiteness. So this will be resonant with our discussions on answer to Job as well, right? Um, we are, however, it goes on, the pleroma itself, but we are distinguished from the pleroma in our essence as creation, which is confined within time and space. Because we're parts of the pleroma is also in us. I mean, it's obviously going to feel it's paradoxical. It's slightly, one might say esoteric, but there are reasons to
Yeah.
say that it's equally scientific, in my opinion. Um, but
And
we,
just to throw in a little plug for Spinoza here, to read
yeah,
Spinoza against those who would
yeah,
just lob him in with the substance thinkers. When he refers to infinite substance or God or nature, there's thought and extension, which are the two attributes that we can be aware of in our experience as human beings, but there are infinitely many other attributes, right? And so um, I think how Jung is describing the pleroma here so far fits quite well with how Spinoza would define infinite substance, right?
yeah, as long as we're reading Spinoza in a dynamic
Yeah,
logis.
yeah,
Uh, so maybe, Deleuze's Spinoza, but
yeah,
maybe that is Spinoza, but maybe again, it's one of these problems with Spinoza scholarship that I'm not going to adjudicate. But I'm well aware of those readings of Spinoza, of course. Yeah,
sure.
um,
Continue.
I love them. So we're distinguished from the pleroma in our essence as creation, which is confined within time and space, right? So differentiated beings, objects, individuals, etc., are in time and space, right? So they're not eternal in that sense, right? And this is, um, you know, Simondon has a lot to say about the nature of transduction and time, and that time is the first dimension of transduction.
Mm.
Uh, Transduction is kind of inheritance. I mean, it's complicated, but um, Transduction is the way that a crystal, for example, but it's much more general than this, is structuring the metastable milieu, which is the supersaturated pre-individual mother liquor. And it's a spreading, right? It's a growing, right? So I always like this quote from, I think it's Paul Valéry, and I think, I got it from Prigogine and Stengers actually, but it's time is construction. And so that's very specifically what Simondon would be saying, but also what Jung is saying here.
Mm.
Uh, so actualization, again, I've said this, coming to definiteness. Also, the pleroma is in us, as he says. Consider answer to Job and the indwelling of the paraclete. So we talked about this when we talked about answer to Job, and I specifically likened it to vital individuals maintaining that charge of the pre-individual. So
Mm.
the indwelling of the paraclete is what enables, humans to be contributors to the ongoing creation. Um, and this is, the ongoing process of individuation of self and world, and that's what vital individuals but not necessarily not physical individuals, but in different ways, are doing in Simondon, maintaining this charge of the pre-individual. And sometimes it would be this relationship with the pre-individual, but there is a pre-individual that is internal as well as external in the milieu, right?
Mm.
Jung goes on. Differentiation is creation. Man differentiates since his essence is differentiation. If we remain true to our essence, which is differentiation, we do not fall under the spell of the pleroma, namely into nothingness. So we talked about this a little bit before, right? You were talking in terms of inflation, like thinking we can identify with the pleroma, um, like absolute dissolution, absolute deterritorialization, or something like that. That's a danger that Jung is signaling here. Uh,
Mm.
we are differentiation. We are differentiated and differentiating. Um, Not your thinking, even though I think it's not your thinking. It's not just your thinking. Not your thinking, but your essence is differentiation. So it's not just that thought differentiates. It's like you differentiate on all levels of your being that is becoming. Therefore, you must not strive for what you conceive as distinctiveness, but for your own essence. I think this is really important in reading Jung. Um,
Mm.
Again, not that you can't find lots of contradictory stuff in Jung, obviously, but um, he's saying, like, if you differentiate an idea of yourself in thought, your conception of a distinctive, this is who I could be, and you may convince yourself that this is who I should be, and all of that. And then you aim only at that. It's not that we shouldn't have ideals and all of that either, but if you confuse that with your essence as differentiation, then you are limiting yourself in this sense, right? So don't strive for what you conceive as distinctiveness, because not only thought is differentiation, therefore thought cannot encompass the possibilities of differentiation, right? Thought is a particular form of differentiation. Um, don't strive for what you conceive as distinctiveness, but for your own essence, which is again differentiation. So my little gloss here is that, like, when Jung would talk, and it's obviously a Nietzschean sentiment about becoming what you are. It's not about seeking a predefined essential self. It's not like there is some you that you need to be that is predefined for all time or whatever. It's about differentiating as an irreducibly particular aspect of the world, and of course, in relation to other such aspects. So it is
Mm.
your nature to be a differentiating and thus irreducibly particular aspect of the world. Uh,
Yeah, I like to say that, each of us, the process of psychic individuation is becoming a unique recapitulation of the universal.
yeah.
Would that work
Well,
for you? I mean, is that
well, I'm worried about universal. Does it have a capital U? But it's back to this discussion of the logos, right? You're a recapitulation of that generic dynamic, which is
Mm.
differentiation itself, the process
Yeah.
of
It's just
differentiation.
that particular often implies a part that doesn't, as Jung is saying earlier, contain the whole. The particular contains the whole. That's the pleroma is in us just as much as
Yeah.
we are parts of the pleroma.
Yeah. But then I think again, we're back to what is universal is particularity, just in the sense that
Mm. Or
what,
differentiation.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, so just in the sense that what is universal, or change is the only constant. These are, like, slightly trite truisms, but what is universal is firstness in Persian sense, right?
Mhm.
Um, so every object, every thing, whatever, the most generic term you want to use, is irreducibly particular at
Mm.
some level of analysis. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have its characteristics of secondness and thirdness. It can't be assimilated to a class and also classified and all that kind of stuff, but it is still irreducibly particular in a very, like, formal sense. It's a giving nominalism its due without being nominalist. There are real generals. There aren't only bare particulars, but the particulars are actually what is universal and first. So in the Darwinian sense, or the Persian sense, I think it's justifiable to call this Persian. Um, the you know the generals are particular distributions, like clumpy distributions of
Mhm.
particulars in an important sense, and they're real because they are, like, effective and affective. Like, they're forceful in some sense, although this could get us into this conversation about the agency of forms and all of that, which is not where we want to go right now. Um,
Mm.
but they're like a top-down constraint, if you want. Again, I think we need to problematize, not go back into that overly hierarchical view. But for lack of a better, for in shorthand, they are like a top-down constraint. And of course, we can find all kinds of empirical examples of that. Everything from, what Alicia Guerrero would call a virtual governor, something like a Bénard cell in the non-equilibrium thermodynamic system, or a norm, a social norm, a language itself that constrains and enables thought, all of this stuff. Um, but these things are, again, if you're thinking ontogenesis as first philosophy, these things are derived. They have to be derived. Otherwise, you'd be putting that principle or that preformed structure, concept, whatever, prior to ontogenesis, and then ontogenesis is no longer first philosophy. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
so he mentioned this. I mentioned this. This is Jung again. I mentioned that to free you from the delusion that we are able to think about the pleroma. Okay, fundamentally, this is apophatic negative theology, and on some, we are speaking from the ground of our own distinctiveness and about our own differentiation. Yet we need to speak about our own differentiation so that we may sufficiently differentiate. So the pleroma is not something that we actually know, um, and certainly not something we can speak about or think about. But it is what must be. It's this minimal posit in order for this ongoing
Mhm.
differentiation to be
Mhm.
possible. But even in our most profoundly, you know, psychedelic, psyche eliciting, phanerothymic, revelation of rhythm, you know, experience of firstness,
Yeah.
we are not knowing the absolutely undifferentiated indeterminacy of being. We are perceiving it as a limit, and in some sense, we're approaching that limit, like we're
Yeah.
coming in contact with the limit, but we're not, you know.
So if in Deleuze, there's a discussion in Difference and Repetition of Schelling's theology
Mhm.
and his distinction between ground and existence, divine ground and divine existence, and these two potencies in the divine nature, wrath and love, and the ground. And this is coming out of Jakob Böhme too. The divine ground is unconscious and wrathful in the sense that it's all about this process of differentiation. And divine existence is what, in a sense, um, God may become if we, as if in our own differentiation as human beings, we're able to relate to the ground, that wrath, so as to bring about, through what for Schelling would be an act of freedom, and then Jung would be this um, holotropic movement that's never finished. You never arrive at the wholeness of your
Yeah.
essential self, but you're moving towards wholeness. I think we would have to say in Jung's sense, and maybe Simondon's different, and maybe Deleuze wouldn't accept that reading. But this
Yeah.
relationship between divine ground, which is wrathful and unconscious, and divine existence, which is loving and conscious, very much depends on the role of the human being as a mediator between the two. And I think Jung's understanding of individuation, drawing on this, German romantic tradition and mystical tradition, going back to Eckhart and Boehme and mystics like that, is that, whether or not we can speak of uh, the existence of the divine very much depends on our own how we meet this process of differentiation in ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I'm very sympathetic in many ways to all of that, to a lot of that, but I would still want to language things a little bit differently. And actually, this last point on this slide sort of relates to this. The minimal posit required to begin, this is just rehashing what we've already said, but is simply the undetermined, the ongoing, the inexhaustible, the past, present, and future pre-individual. But it's not that, so Peirce has this image, Ryan, and I'll stop sharing screen for a moment and I'll find where we should go next.
Mm,
And maybe into into Psyche and Simondon and the numinosity of images and the trans individual. We can try and cover those things relatively quickly and then finish. But Peirce has this image that you and I have discussed in I guess of the riddle about evolutionary realism and the what he thinks of as the necessary posit of evolutionary realism, which is the absolute past is the absolutely undetermined, right? So pure firstness, which is of course very consistent with what we're talking about. But the absolute future is the scattercrystal, as I call it.
mhm,
My friend David Freyas coined that, but the crystal at the end of time. So the world of pure secondness, and in between is thirdness, which is the mediation between those two poles. Um, this image has a lot of resonance with what you were just saying,
mm.
um, but I
Right.
reject it. I reject it um, because, in fact, the absolute past and the absolute future are both absolutely
Great.
indeterminate. Are
Mm,
both pre-individual, right? So it's not that the dynamic that you're describing, or even that Peirce is describing, doesn't exist in nature and isn't part of the reality of becoming, right? And obviously, the crystal itself and Simondon's discussion of the crystal is very relevant to this. That kind of becoming exists in nature and in a normal situation. So in an artificial crystallization, like we discussed, or I didn't say it was artificial, you can potentially maintain the gradients of a supersat. You keep replenishing it in some sense so that
mhm,
the crystal in theory has an open-ended growth, but actual crystallization processes tend to be very bounded, right? There will be an exhaustion of the tensions in that mother liquor, in that supersaturated liquid, and the crystal will fully achieve its end. It will fully crystallize, it will exhaust those tensions, and then you've got a crystal, and it's incredibly beautiful and wonderful, right? Great, we love crystals. Oh, I still want to talk about Answer to Job, but because Jung has a specific critique of this image in Answer to Job, which we talked about in Answer
mm,
to Job when he's talking about revelation and the image of heaven as containing all of these crystalline beings, and Jung just nails it. Crystals are dead, people, dead. You know,
mhm,
um, this is the thing about Peirce's, final final solution. I mean, Jung is talking about final solution, right? When he's talking about revelation, he's critiquing that notion.
Yeah.
Jung's omega, I mean, Peirce's omega is a dead world. Uh,
Mhm,
the future is radically pre-individual in the same way that the past is saying the world doesn't die like that. The world is open-ended. And so
mhm,
in a sense, when we're talking about whole moving towards wholeness, not that that's not a thing, and not that there isn't really important and beautiful wisdom in the stuff you were talking about from Burma and others. And again, it's a very, I mean, you can even think about the Empedoclean route, war and strife, love and strife and all of that, which of course Peirce also directly references when he talks about
mhm,
evolutionary realism. Well, he talks about evolutionary love, another beautiful Peirce essay. This is a tradition of thought that we know and we're familiar with, and I'm not saying it's not loaded with wisdom, but I would still want to say that we both move towards wholeness and away from it all the time. And
Yeah.
that's de-differentiation. We're always de-differentiating.
Yep.
And this, I think, is the compensatory movement in Jung.
Yeah.
Br- Bringing something to consciousness always results in something else. Differentiating something, actualizing something into consciousness results in a compensatory de-differentiation. Um, and again,
Mm.
I don't think that's necessary. It's not like, in the sense that it's not like pre-individuality is some exhaustible resource. So you need to kind of de-differentiate something I mean, in psyches, you need to do that because they have a limited bandwidth. I don't think the pre-individual per se works in that sense, but I just would want to say that, yeah, we move towards wholeness, but we also move away from it at the same time.
Yeah. No, I mean, and Jung's distinction between perfection and completeness is very
Exactly.
relevant here. There's this temptation in the theological traditions of the West to try to appropriate perfection or to imagine the divine as uh, moving history towards a final state of perfection. And Jung's very much resisting that as completely out of psychological
Yeah.
balance and in need of always going to trigger a shadow response of an antichrist that's going to come in and really fuck up your attempt at perfection.
I listened to your talk, man, and it's bang on. And of course, we had talked about that in both the discussion of Answer to Job and Problem of the Fourth. And my next slide in this very talk is the individuation is open-ended slide, and the first point is ex perfecto nihil fit.
Hmm.
Jung's beautiful little, maxim from Answer to Job, right? From the perfect comes nothing. And that's
Hmm.
what we've been talking about this the whole time. It's like from that, if you had a predefined, if a crystal was at the beginning of time, which it kind of is in, say, Laplace, but also in monotheism, in a lot of, traditional
Yeah.
understandings of creation,
Hmm.
uh, you know,
Yeah.
everything's already done.
Right.
Um, and Peirce
Which
also,
is, yeah, that's where predestination in St. Augustine comes from, which is I think, really pernicious idea seeded early on. Then, it's Parmenidean, it's this obsession with the one. It's not just originating in Augustine, but there are ways in which there are these elements of the theological tradition that need to be
yes,
resisted.
yeah,
Um, Even though from for me, it's like part of an evolutionary metaphysics and a genealogical method is like, okay, we're inheriting all of this.
yeah, yeah.
How do we think with it even when how do we acknowledge or never forget that we're still thinking with the tradition even when we think against it?
And I agree. And so you can think of it as a quote unquote imminent critique. And so
Yeah.
it's like I'm not rejecting as such the footnotes to Plato claim. I'm not, rejecting as such the footnotes to Christianity claim in some sense, right? We're thinking in those traditions. It's just that every aspect of those traditions is up for grabs, even as they have differentiated our thought to a certain point where we can move through
Mhm.
them. And so part of that genealogical method is then recognizing those aspects of those traditions which have sailed under the radar sometimes, like in a reactionary movement like science, a reactionary offshoot of Christian theology, reactionary in the sense that it's trying to repudiate the notion of the omniscient God, and of course the church's claim to being this, um, source of truth, representation of God's truth on earth, and all of that. And it's supposedly an anti-authoritarian movement in some sense, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, motto of the Royal Society, all that stuff. But what gets sunk into the presuppositions of science, which I know you and I very much agree on, but we can look at it in a formal sense in terms of what are the presuppositions of like Laplacian effective theory and how much are they taking the structure of monotheism over and instantiating it in the bedrock of physical
Yeah.
science.
Yeah. No, I
Um,
mean, there's no question science is reacting against the church scholasticism, but at the same time, without Thomas Aquinas bringing Aristotle together with Christianity, you never get the scientific revolution. You
well,
never get the sense that nature could be studied and reveal a lawful order, right? And so
yeah,
it's a reaction against that's also presupposing a theology.
I absolutely agree that that's a matter of contingent history. I would also say that this is a presupposition of philosophy, and it's even what the pre-Socratics were doing.
Mhm.
So it's not that without Aquinas per se, or you wouldn't have that. It's that is a particular strand of Western and not only Western thought, and I mean even the empiricism of the shaman in an archaic culture
Mhm.
who has all this incredible knowledge of the plants that can be used for medicine and the behavior. Like, science is very, very deep in our, species being, if you want.
Yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying
Yeah,
that,
and there are a lot of mutations. I didn't mean to just pin it all on Aquinas, but I'm not I'm not a Thomist. They're maybe as annoying as the dogmatic Spinozist, but he's also you have the Renaissance and all of these Platonic texts being translated that bring back mathematics and the Pythagorean insight that's also formative for in overcoming the Aristotelian emphasis on categorizing everything. Now you have this mathematical emphasis when Plato is recovered in the Renaissance that of course is so crucial for what um, Galileo and Newton and Kepler would end up doing. So it's lots of mutations in that
yeah. No, and
process.
I totally agree. So I agree that we're thinking there is an absolute imperative for studying that, intellectual history in a
Mhm.
genealogical register, in an ont in
Got this
an,
book right behind me. Yeah.
in an ontogenetic register. Um, but also it's about exploring the degrees of freedom that
Yeah. Yeah,
we
we're not determined by this inheritance
yeah.
either. Yeah.
We're enabled by it. It's a set of constraints, but they are enabling constraints. And what someone like Simondon is doing, and Whitehead, is trying to think a contemporary thought. Not and Jung. Psychoanalysts, psychologists must be engaged with the you know contemporary currents of their time. This is a huge part of Jung's project. We're not just trying to recover something, obviously, and we're then looking at. So when we're critiquing, all the things we've been critiquing in this discussion, and we're bringing up, a particular reading one might have of Plotinus or of um, Plato or Spinoza for that matter, or anyone, it's not it's not a matter of obviously not refuting Plotinus or Plato or something absurd like that. Um, but it is I mean, it's a matter of generating those novel readings, but it's a matter of looking at what in those traditions and where have things gone to fixation, and sometimes in a sort of subconscious manner, in an uncritically analyzed set of presuppositions that we nonetheless have to pull out and critique. So it's not about like refuting um, Christianity or something like that either, but it is just about saying, look, there are these particular ideas, there are these particular ways of understanding oneness or predestination, preformation, all of those sorts of things, and those do need to be critiqued. At the end of all of that, as in process theology, although again, I'm not saying there aren't aspects of that I wouldn't critique, but at the end of that, you can still recover a kind of positive theology if that is your
Right.
desire.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say that is then ultimate and that
Right.
positive theology encompasses everything, you're back in the same position that is my primary target, which is saying, no, the negative theology is actually primary in that sense, right? But it's the
Mhm.
variation, the
Yeah.
particularity, the
I guess,
pre.
yeah. I mean, my point is really just like the Laplacian determinism is prefigured by Augustinian predestination, right? And so even though you're shifting from a religious to a scientific register, it's basically the same structure of thought, right?
No, yeah, it's not just prefigured, it's homologous. It is exactly the same structure. And that is explicit in really in Laplace's writings,
Well, even
The
though he says I have no need of, we don't need a God, it's still you're presupposing that metaphysically.
yeah.
Um,
I mean the formalisms are a diagrammatization,
yeah.
and this is where Whitehead has his affinities, but with all the differences that we've discussed, are a diagrammatic rendering of the operator, the God operator, um, and that is, yeah. I mean, it is. I mean,
So,
simply intellectual theology.
um, can we do the numinosity of images in like couple of minutes, or what do you think? Is that too tall an
Well,
order?
I mean, we can begin it, and maybe we just need to return to this stuff another time. But we can definitely sort of prefigure a discussion of psyche, trans-individual, numinosity of images, images, quasi-organism, and the image cycle
Hmm.
in Simondon in a very couple of minutes.
Yeah,
Uh,
let's prefigure it, and then we're definitely. I want to read the form information and
yeah,
potentials,
yeah, yeah.
1960 talk and the responses to it from those luminaries who were present on the panel, and then we have that other article by Deroux that stages a imaginary dialogue between Whitehead and Simondon. So we can definitely return to these themes, but maybe give us a teaser.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, oops, I haven't shared screen. We're not going to stop tarrying with, well, I'm not going to stop tarrying with Simondon. So I do find his thought very useful.
Mhm.
Um, and so again, I mean, these are mostly about these resonances with Jung, obviously, because this was specifically for this, why Jungians might find Simondon interesting kind of talk. But the numinosity of images, right? The word image, Simondon says, is generally understood as designating a mental content of which we can be conscious. But there is no evidence that even in the best cases, consciousness exhausts the entire reality of this local activity. We might surmise that the conscious aspects of the local activity are cases of an almost exceptional surfacing, connected to a continuous framework. They're connected to an infrastructure that carries them along after having prepared them. And this is very much what Felix Guattari would be talking about. I mean, and obviously Deleuze, but as the machinic unconscious. And that is a very, I mean, it's a psychoanalytic conception. It's a and a lot of resonance with Jung, obviously. Why should we exclude as illusory? This is an empirical posit. Oh, we should have talked about transcendental empiricism, but we'll have to do that another time too. This is empirical in the same way that Jung treats psychic reality as empirical. Why should we, a priori, exclude as illusory those characteristics whereby an image resists our free will, in which it refuses to let the subject's will direct it and presents itself according to its own forces, living in our consciousness like an intruder disturbing the order of a household? That's very, Freudian. What is it? A path in the future of psychoanalysis. It's his essay, really nice essay that he has about the problem of psychoanalytic reception, like why psychoanalysis will never be a kind of popular thought because ego is not master in its own household, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Reminds me of Bachelard too, and how he treats images,
yeah.
letting them have their autonomy, which I think
Yes.
is an important influence on Simondon.
100%. And in fact, in the introduction to these quotes come from a lecture series that Simondon gave, a lecture course that Simondon gave called Imagination and Invention, which it was translated in 2020, published in English in 2022. And it's a really amazing study. And there's a lot of discussion of Bachelard in the introduction or the preface by a philosopher, what is it, Jean-Yves Chateau. But Simondon doesn't talk a lot about Bachelard, but if you look at his like recommended reading, his bibliography, it includes like all of Bachelard. So yeah, I mean Bachelard is a big figure for Simondon. There's no question. And also someone that he probably could have assumed that students of this course at the Sorbonne would have been familiar with. Um, so yeah, and Bachelard is a reader of Jung as well. Um, this independence and objectivity of the image struck the thinkers of antiquity, and that's kind of evidence in itself of the psychic reality of this independence and objectivity of the image to Simondon, just in a very Jungian sense, that Jung's like, well, we're doing this comparative study of the history of, religion and myth and blah, 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 because that is our um, substrate for an empirical study of the contents of psyche. This is just what, Simondon is saying. Um, the image that overcomes the subject is an apparition. It reveals, makes manifest, declares something beyond the order of quotidian realities. It is of the numinous, halfway between the objective and the subjective. And I'm sure, I mean, maybe he read Otto and got numinous directly, but I would imagine he probably, got the term from Jung. And of course, numinosity here, Simondon is saying halfway between the objective and the subjective. And this, again, is this really important notion of mediation. Simondon is always a thinker of the metaxu, of the middle ground. He's always saying that the middle ground is a dark zone that is concealed when we only take the extreme terms into account, form and matter, mind and like psyche and world, objective and subjective, etc. Right? Um, So there's all this stuff about the image as a quasi-organism. What I would really quickly introduce us to, if that's okay, is this notion of an image cycle in Simondon. That can be where we stop. We won't get onto the trans individual. We'll do the trans individual another time. Um, that can be where we stop because this is so interesting and crucial. And so I can just introduce those notions and then we can have a chat about that, and that can be the end. Yeah, does that
Sure,
work?
that sounds good.
All right.
Yeah.
So the image cycle is this three-stage cycle in Simondon. Stage one is spontaneity. So Simondon describes this as pure and spontaneous growth prior to the experience of the object. It's pre-adapted but not adapted. It's a motor tendency. This is really, really crucial for the involvement of the body and like the material. Again, very consistent with Simondon's thought across the board, and why I would say that in some sense his thought is like a choric materialism after the chora. But images themselves, again, psyche and body are not disconnected. The contents of psyche have their genesis in the body. So stage one is this very embodied motor tendency, rich in endogenous motor elements, a non-controlled anticipation developing in a free state without strict correlation to other subsets of psychic activity. So it's not pre-constrained by the rest of psyche in that sense, right? So I'm saying here, this spontaneous movement corresponds to primary variation in evolutionary and developmental systems. So, I talk about this all the time. Stochastic gene expression, spontaneous brain activity, and very specifically what Simondon is talking about here is autokinetic behavior, spontaneous movement, which is babbling, like motor babbling, right? The organism moves in order to elicit feedback from the milieu. Autokinetic movement is palpation. Again, we've talked about this before. I think we had a great discussion on individuation as elicitation, actually, when we were talking about Levin and Deacon. And so I brought a lot of Simondon and Peirce into that discussion. But it's
Yeah.
like, I say when you got to go and you don't know where to go, you just go. If you're in a cave and you can't see anything, you start feeling around, touching the walls, trying to work out where you are. This is what is being discussed here. And Simondon is saying that this is how the image even has its origin in the most simple organisms, in a single-celled organism with its pseudopodia palpating the surroundings and working out based on the feedback that it elicits from the environment. Do I go this way or that way or whatever, right? So it's reciprocal elicitation, right? And in fact, what I'm saying here is a generalization. The organism, or indeed physis itself, like nature, moves because it is its nature to move. It is the nature of nature to move. That's again very consistent with what we were saying. This I have a shout out to Georges Canguilhem, and of course my talk Life is Technical, which people can watch because you've shared it on your channel earlier. It's my talk from the Biophilosophy Conference, where I go into a lot of detail about the link between this kind of conception and vitalism. And this is about the vitality of the image again, right? And it's somatopsychic nature. So note the dependence on the body and problem of the fourth is a key reference there. So in stage two, this is receptivity. The image becomes a mode of receiving information. Now it's functional, organizing and stabilizing itself or themselves, these populations in some sense of quasi-organisms, which are the images that live inside organisms. In internally correlated groups according to dimensions of the relationship between the organism and the milieu, right? So they are coordinated by this individuation of sensory motor schemas in the relational process between organism and milieu in this second stage. And so I've again put in the evolutionary triad here. Variation is spontaneity and autokinesis. Selection is this relational, situational signification. So selection is the establishment of a relationship of feedback here between organism and milieu, which is signification. This is the origin of meaning, right, for Simondon as well. And inheritance is then amplification and stabilization of that selected subset, like the creation of a relatively structured schema, for example. And then the final stage, and this is where I'll stop. I'm saying this is Simondon's account of the genesis of what Jung would call psychic reality, or the imaginal in Henri Corbin. So after this stage of interaction with the milieu corresponding to a learning process, so that second stage of the consolidation of schemas is a learning process. So selection again is big there. And affective emotional repercussion completes the organization of images according to a systematic mode of linkages, evocations, and communications. Now, we're not going to get to this, but when we talk about the trans-individual in the future, we'll talk about Simondon identifying Jungian archetypes as affectivo-emotional themes. And so the way individuation works in the collect, like between psyches, reciprocally in the trans individual, is in terms of affectivo-emotional resonance, not just in terms of say like shared discrete ideas per se, right? So this is the objectification of images for Simondon. They're capable of abstraction, these are my words, but of departing from the direct relationship to the originary relationship with the milieu and of being transported, reinserted, or recombined. This is also the basis of a notion of invention. That's why the course is called Imagination and Invention. The image now has its own kind of internal coherence with itself. So that means it can be moved away from the direct relationship with the milieu and like taken and put somewhere else into the milieu, right? So you can think niche construction. Obviously, this links to his whole thing about technical objects. So it's a theory of objectification, or I would say a theory of natural abstraction, which is like very, very, very important for the kind of thinking that we do, in my opinion. Invention, as I say, is the consequence of the saturation and overflowing. Well, there's a slightly Platinian choice of words there, my words, actually, I think Simondon uses that word directly, of the image cycle via the manifestation of the image schema in an object. All right, so here's this key point. This is the last thing I'm going to read, and then we'll stop sharing. A veritable mental world is constituted in this way, right? With regions, domains, qualitative key points through which the subject commands an analog of the external milieu. Okay, this mental world is derived from the world, right? It's not de novo creation, but then it has its autonomy, and the images that live in it have that autonomy, that numinosity that we just spoke about. This analog of the external milieu has its own constraints, its own topology, its own complex modalities of access. In other words, images would undergo successive mutations that would modify their mutual relations by making them pass from the status of primitive mutual independence, that's independence amongst one another, like amongst images, to a phase of interdependence at the moment the object is encountered, to a final state of systematic and necessitating linkage in which primitively kinetic energies, remembering this is all grounded in movement, have become tensions within a system, which is that mental world itself. So there's the origin of an entirely novel system here, which is the mental world or psychic reality, from these kinetic energies and the organism milieu relationship and all of that. Okay.
Wow. I mean, Simondon read Bergson, right? I mean, matter and memory, Bergson unpacks this account of images. I think he even says something like the universe is an aggregate of images.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So Simondon absolutely engaged. I mean, he's a French philosopher, a
yeah,
French Protestant philosopher. A
yeah. I
lot
mean,
of
of course,
yeah, yeah.
this just sounds like pure Bergson to me, though. I mean,
Well, I think it will be then important, and I'm not, don't even have the capacity right now to have that conversation,
mhm.
to talk about all of Simondon's critiques of Bergson. So
Mm.
Simondon is, of course, Bergsonian in an important sense, like he's
Oh,
somewhat Jungian, he's somewhat Bachelardian or whatever, but mostly when he actually talks about Bergson, because in a sense, he takes, I think, these kinds of influences for granted. Like that is his milieu, right? But like all of these guys are moving from Bergson in important ways. He's very critical of very specific
mm.
points in Bergson, and ultimately his theory of image is, what I should find is just a really good quote from Chateau exactly on this. You
Mm.
keep talking, and then I'll
Well, just
find.
even this idea of the image or imagination mediating between extreme terms like mind and matter or whatever. I mean, Bergson's making that same
Yeah,
same point in matter
cool.
and memory. And Bergson will say like our own body is the primary image.
Mhm.
Um, he's trying to overcome a kind of representationalist account of knowledge by emphasizing the role of imagination as a mediator here between extreme terms, that we're not just making internal copies of the external world, which, what the quotes you were just sharing, it's like Simondon striving to find as Deleuze was, a non-representational account of how mind, in some sense, is able to generate a not independent, but derive a model of the world from its experience of the environment. But yeah, I mean, I don't, I'm not equipped to argue for how much Simondon is drawing on Bergson there and where the differences might be, but it seemed at least to evoke my memory of matter and memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a few quotes here. I can't find the exact thing I was trying to find, but it should be noted that in spite of any critique you might level at Bergson, Simondon maintains a principled position that is profoundly Bergsonian. Um, there's a huge critique of Sartre in this whole imagination and invention course, and really
Hmm.
Sartre is critiquing Bergson and Bergson's notion of the imagination, and Sartre is basically seeing the imagination as something that just gets between us and reality, and so it's completely removed from reality, has no real relation to it, and we get confused when we treat imagination as and also imagination for Sartre is like has nothing in it that we didn't put there. And you contrast that with the numinosity of images that's being described here. And so Simondon is profoundly taking Bergson's side in a stoush between
Oh, interesting.
Bergson and Sartre, but he is then extending Bergson quite profound.
Sure.
He's I think what Chateau says at some point here, and there's a bunch of discussion of matter and memory in this introduction, but that Simondon is he goes well beyond Bergson's attempts to deny all objectivity in the image and to repudiate all the forces belonging to the world of image would be to go against common sense. That's still pretty Bergsonian. It's something about Bergson is the enabling condition of Simondon being considerably more rigorous than Bergson and integrating that basically Bergsonian idea into sort of contemporary and many strands of psychology, what would become cognitive science and of course all of his other influences, right? So his theory of the genesis of images here is just a version of his theory of individuation, for which he has his physical accounts, his biological accounts, etc. But he's definitely taking off from Bergson.
Nice. Cool. Well, I don't know how long we've been recording, but we've hit the 3 hour mark of our
Yeah, about 2 hours. Yeah.
Zoom session together, and we'll have to leave the fourth missing for now. But I think we need to stick on Simondon next time we chat
Yeah,
and read form, information, and potentials, read the Deroux, or discuss the Deroux. I have to read form, information, and potentials. I did read that last part on Jung because I searched
yeah,
for where he mentions Jung. But yeah, really generative, dare I say, ontogenerative.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, there's so much. I mean, axiontology, like if we talked about
Oh, right. Yeah.
method and all of that. I mean, there's a lot more. Not that my talk is only there as something which can ground us in some Simondonian themes, but even in the talk, there's a bunch of other things that I know you're really interested in, like axiontology and allegmatics. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, we can talk about Simondon till the cows come home. I mean, I'd be really interested, aside from the obvious, Bergsonian resonances, to to develop a discussion of the genesis of psychic reality and psyche and Simondon and how, where that's ultimately going to sit with you.
Mhm.
Because, I think you're inclined to the view, right, that um, reality becoming is always already psychic, right?
Yeah, but the word the panpsychism is such a blunt instrument, and I get the problems with that term and the way that it's been co-opted by a certain rendering of that a certain kind of ontology that I don't like. That's very much a substance approach
Yeah,
to it. So
yeah.
in this context, I'm very happy to differentiate
Yeah.
psychic being from vital being, etc. So,
So I think, putting Simondon in dialogue with, Whitehead and the notion of experience, but also Peirce and the notion of mind,
hmm,
as these three different process thinkers, which use those words all slightly different, and just sort of tracking what distinctions they're trying to make differentially, that Simondon is trying to make very clear distinctions between the vital, the physical, the psychical, etc., but that they are operational distinctions, not substantial distinctions. And then you can see how very close he really is, if the language may be different, but to Whitehead and Peirce. Uh,
yeah.
and
Yeah, I
and
mean, for Whitehead, a psyche, like an animal form of experience, is operationally different from other ways in which actual occasions inherit from one another
yeah,
in the physical world, right? And so it's not substantially different. There's no gap between physics and biology and
yeah.
psychology.
Yeah.
Um,
He would be accused, I mean, by Hans Jonas and others, of not having, being gappy enough.
hmm,
Whereas, Simondon is strongly signaling those gaps in his choice of terminology, maybe more strongly than Whitehead.
hmm,
But like the terms that they choose to generalize or not, like as you know, pre-physical reality is pre-vital and pre-physical and pre-psychical and all of that for Simondon. It's just like I don't want to
yeah,
say, I'm going to say category error, but it's just the wrong thing to do to apply one of those derived terms to something that is, the condition of the genesis of all of them. But there is then also still a way in which the psyche is, like our experience, of course, is
like
fundamental.
Jung's psychic reality. We can't get outside of it.
Yeah, and psyche is fundamental. Like, and you'll
Mhm.
see this in the sort of axiontological and allegmatic method, and what I was saying about, we can't know the individuation of other beings directly. We can only experience our own individuation in parallel with them. Like psyche is so important for Simondon, and there is a way that it is, an intensification of.
Mhm.
Um, but really, it's just our experience of this generic dynamic. And I think that is ultimately what Whitehead means by experience. It's what Peirce means by mind. And
Yeah.
it's obviously what it's deeply Schellingian. And again, I think this ties in with the notion of transcendental empiricism in ways
Mhm.
that could be also really fertile to explore. That's
Yeah.
Deleuze's approach, but he signals his debt to Simondon, but also Marcel Proust, but
Yeah.
obviously Kant and Hume, and Whitehead. Um,
Yeah. Let's dig into all that. Looks like somebody wants to walk.
yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
Tim.
cool,
Good
man.
stuff. We'll be in touch about our various projects. Otherwise, we'll do this again next week, maybe.
Yeah, we could probably double up. Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Cool. All right, man.
Talk
Take
to you
care.
soon. Bye.